The turmoil of British Leyland is my automotive happy place. In the culmination of so much history, revolution and know-how, there's an endless supply of stories to tell. But today on TwinCam, we're joined by the car that I reckon is the epitome of both the good and the bad. Not only is this a Triumph TR7, but a Triumph TR7 Sprint. Before we get into it, this car is to be auctioned by Mann Classics. But with over 50 years behind it, the TR7 remains deeply controversial, and arguably it's the one that ended Britain's sports car domination. But as a mid-70s product of the infamous British Leyland, there was an awful lot going on behind the scenes that will ultimately shape our view of what the wedge was supposed to be. So before going anywhere else, we're going to need a bit of a history lesson. The turbulent world of British Leyland. Founded in 1968 as a merger between two of Britain's motoring giants, BMH and Leyland, the idea was that a new firm would become too big to fail. We'll certainly see about that. But in that first year, the two holding firms brought together the majority of Britain's big motoring names under one banner. There was Austin, Morris, MG, Wolseley, Riley, Van den Plas, Jaguar, Rover and Triumph, all competing for space and for attention. It goes without saying that there was a fair chunk of product overlap, and the clearest way to see this is through the lens of the sports car. In 1973, MG, Triumph and Jaguar were BL's three sporting marques, and from the top of the tree we find the iconic E-Type. Now with fuel injection added to its V12, Jaguar were very lucky in that they remained operationally independent from the rest of the BL melting pot, and a halo sports car would remain very much on their terms. Further down, however, we find the sonorous 8-cylinder Triumph Stag. As brilliant as it was, this beautiful Grand Tourer was having a very tough time of it thanks to a truly appalling reputation for unreliability. Somewhat more successful was the Triumph TR6, complete with classic sports car appeal and a tough 2.5 litre straight six, an engine you could get with fuel injection and up to 150 brake horsepower. The heart of BL's monopoly, however, was the evergreen MG B, still the most popular sports car the world has ever seen, and available in 73 as roadster or coupé, with either its standard 1804 or Rover's 3.5 litre V8. At the base of the range were the competing MG Midget and Triumph Spitfire, the latter with a coupe-bodied 6-cylinder brother, the Triumph GT6. Of course, there are some brilliant cars in amongst, but with 7 different nameplates and 6 different engines, BL's sheer plurality of sports cars could not last forever. To add some immediacy to proceedings, while MGs and Triumphs sold fantastically well, they were getting really quite old. The TR6 may have hailed from 1968, but it was a facelift of a car from 1961, with suspension from 63 and an engine from 1960. The MG B was a little bit more modern from 1962, but its engine was from the early 1950s, while the MG Midget and Triumph Spitfire were absolutely rooted in the era of Macmillan and Eisenhower. Come the miners' strike and Watergate, therefore, the average American could have gone out and bought a Datsun S30, and the formation of British Leyland allowed MG and Triumph to develop a new sports car together. At both Abingdon and Canley in the early 1970s, orders had yet to come as to what a new corporate sports car may look like. Instead, development continued independently for a new MGD GT, codenamed ADO 21, and a new mid-range Triumph known as Bullet. In the case of the former, I've done a full in-depth video on the lost MG, so follow the link in the corner if you're interested. But as all affordable sports cars were, these two were based on existing family cars. For MG, a part of the Austin Morris division, that meant transverse engines and fluid suspension, characterised by the likes of the Mini, the best-selling 1100 and the all-new Maxi. This meant that ADO21 was to float on hydroelastic suspension and use the Maxi's overhead cam E-Series engine, available with either 4 or 6 cylinders and a 5-speed gearbox. But rather than relegation to front-wheel drive, the MGD could well have become the world's first truly affordable mid-engine sports car. A package that would have been clothed in a dramatic wedge-shaped body by Austin Morris's chief stylist, Harris Mann. For all intents and purposes, this was the MGF, some 25 years early. 65 miles up the M40, however, the Triumph Bullet looked a lot more conventional. At the turn of the decade, Canley had launched the Triumph Stag, ostensibly a cut-down Triumph 2000 with a T-top and their all-new overhead cam V8. Bullet was to be rather similar, again with a full Targa roof arrangement, presumably semi-trailing arm rear suspension, and half of that new V8, the Triumph Slant 4, known to us for powering the Triumph Dolomite and the Saab 99. They also planned a coupe version known as Lynx, but at the end of 1970, a group of BL's top brass went on a fact-finding mission. They went to figure out what the average American wanted from a British sports car. The US having now been mentioned twice, as it was by far BL's biggest sports car market. Whatever they produced next had to appeal to the States, as this is where the profits lay. On the trip were folks from product planning and former Roverman Spen King, fresh from developing the Range Rover, now appointed chief engineer at Triumph. Now, in terms of sales, MG enormously outsold Triumph, but as the latter were considered upmarket, it was perceived that a Triumph would be more in line with expectations, but critically, owners and dealers prioritised simplicity above all else. If we return to our prototypes, it's the MGD that shines in terms of modernity, never mind its relevance next to the Fiat X19 and, from an American perspective, the Porsche 914. But the wider conservatism of the American market was considered suspect, and with the Datsun 240Z gaining momentum, it was considered a safe bet to stick with a front-mounted engine and rear-wheel drive. Bullet won their approval, but that's not to say that the Triumph TR7 was all Canley's work, and certainly it wasn't aiming for Triumph's existing market. What BL were looking for was a new mid-range sports car to replace their entire existing range, centred of course around their most popular. The Triumph TR7 therefore was not conceived to directly replace the TR6, but instead the best-selling sports car of all time, the MG B. And that is the lens through which we have to view the design, development and engineering of the wedge. In producing only one new mainstream sports car, BL knew that they couldn't make everyone happy. After all, they couldn't build more than one car because they didn't have the money. Austin Morris were dragging down the rest of the group as quality worsened, their tiny profits squeezed, and bankruptcy led to British Leyland's effective nationalisation in 1975. Too big to fail now looked like a bit of a joke. But as this one company was responsible for such a huge proportion of Britain's industry, it would have been an economic catastrophe to let it all come to a halt. This is the environment into which the TR7 launched at the end of 1974, one where a company became a national concern, so reaction was always to be fierce. But as they did back in 1962 with the MG B, they looked to explore new ground. At the end of the 50s, very few people drove sports cars every day. They were built to be weekend cars, housed in dry garages and driven for fun. Most sports cars didn't have locks, never mind boots, and many did without even a roof. The MG B changed this. allowing people to drive their affordable sports cars every day of the week, especially in fastback GT form. As a product aimed squarely across the Atlantic, the TR7 was looking for a very different kind of customer, one that valued practicality, ride comfort and refinement. If someone didn't need 4 seats and wanted to look cool, then why not offer them saloon car luxury in a sports car package? If we study this brochure from midway through production, we see this grand touring nature as central to the car's character. And in all seriousness, if you don't need back seats, then this is as comfortable and hospitable as any contemporary saloon. To meet that challenge, the TR7 is nearly 16 centimetres wider and 18 centimetres longer than an MG B, a car which, in its own quest for refinement, was already larger than a TR6. It may be a chunk shorter than either a Stag or a Datsun, but it's on the same page for width, while this 50-year-old car is longer than today's Mazda MX-5. The Triumph TR7 is not a dainty classic British sports car. It's a truly livable, modern 2-seat coupe, replacing the MG B, sure, but acknowledging the likes of the Alfa Sud Sprint, Ford Capri, Opel Manta and Volkswagen Scirocco. At the end of the day, this car was known as the Triumph TR7 simply because that nomenclature was deemed to have the most value. But first, the headline. This car is not a Triumph TR. That was defined decades earlier as meaning Triumph Roadster, and as the eagle-eyed amongst you might have already noticed, this car is a fixed-head coupe. A drop-top TR7 would eventually rear its head in 1979, but as people shaped their perceptions towards this car, it lacked one of the classic British sports car's most central features. It's an expected British Leyland misstep, but it wasn't totally without reason. Throwing ourselves back to Bullet, we see that it was a Targa, as was the Porsche 914 and the Fiat X19. Certainly, traditional ragtop convertibles were no longer the go-to, all due to a fear of US safety legislation. As part of Ralph Nader's safety crusade, the United States became one of the most restrictive territories in which to sell cars, and manufacturers were growing wary of what was coming next. There was a serious fear that convertible cars were going to be banned, T-tops becoming popular as a potential workaround. In fact, we did a whole video about this saga at the beginning of last year, and 4 years before the TR7, they did a similar thing with the Triumph Stag, selling that car only with a T-bar. The financial might of Mercedes-Benz allowed them to launch the second-gen SL in '71, but only with the insurance policy of the SLC, a car killed off as soon as it became clear that such a law wasn't going to happen. For a time, things were so serious that American manufacturers whole-scale stopped building any form of convertible. So in a bunker as bleak as BL's, this unfortunate reality did make sense. Early on in development, the TR7 was going to feature a Targa roof, but as the concept of a refined, practical sports car advanced, it was settled that, at least initially, the TR7 would only be a fixed-head coupe. This is why it was able to sit slightly above an MG B in the price lists, but it was an immediate red flag for those who wore Owners Club patches and cared about the purity of their sports cars. It's safe to say that some people didn't care for this explanation. The great British sports car had always been an open top, and a heck of a lot of MG B GTs and Triumph GT6s were fitted with fold-back Webasto roofs that offered the best of both worlds. But without even the option of wind in your hair, the TR7 was off to a very bad start. I mentioned earlier that despite its name, the TR7 is not wholly a Triumph product. As British Leyland's unified sports car, it shares bits of Triumph, MG and even Rover beneath. Its foundations may come from Canley, but delegated to MG was its most controversial feature. Building on that mid-engine prototype from earlier, Mann's styling embracing the majesty of the wedge. If anyone asked you to collate a series of designs that exemplify the 1970s, then the Triumph TR7 must be one of them. Everybody seems to have a very strong opinion either way on whether this car is genius or a calamity. But good design always gets people talking, and I'd like to start with the profile. Its fundamental silhouette is imposing, and it's a deeply powerful statement of their boldness back in 1974. Mann was never afraid of looking forwards, and while that means his cars are very much products of their time, as a car deemed accessible to vast swathes of the British public, this was as close to a supercar as you were ever going to get. The TR7 wasn't only the shape of things to come, but it also looks like you can't afford it. My dad was a child of the 70s, and as a kid he saw nothing more exciting on the roads than a brightly coloured TR7. This 50-year-old car looks like a concept, and that is brilliant. In shock factor alone, nothing could quite match the vision of Mann, but it's the detailing that I feel destroys this car's visual appeal. We'll start with the big one, that depressing swage down the side. As such a statement, the silhouette didn't really need the fussiness that this adds, and it's just at odds with the rest of the profile. It strikes me as if he finished the car, then got told by management that it needed a swage to minimise dirt, so he angrily swept across it, and management just rolled with it. Of similar concern is the rear window, which really ought to be recessed into this panel, but instead it's just grafted on, sticking out as an oversight in the otherwise dramatic style. Sticking with the rear, and the back panel should really be blacked out like it is on a Dolomite. That would just tie everything in that bit better. Considering their size, the impact bumpers aren't badly integrated, but my final problem is the bonnet. If this car is to look like a concept, then vents in the bonnet relegate it towards an industrial attitude. They just don't suit it, and as for the pop-up headlamps, well, they're obviously cool, but the big seal around the front and the toilet seat shape don't do it any favours. I admire the TR7's boldness to no end, but it's compromised in a manner that really would make me think twice, and with a customer base so used to a very aged, early 60s chrome-laden style, I understand why some people were so turned off. With only its roof and its styling decided, the TR7 is already about as controversial as an affordable British sports car can get. Though BL's logic is perfectly reasonable, it would be fair to suggest that a fair chunk of customers would be alienated at merely their first glance. But when handed over a brochure or taken for a test drive, those feelings may only multiply. At the heart of them, BL sports cars were very simple mechanically. An MG B had lever arm dampers, for goodness sake. But that MG concept from earlier, and worse, the Triumph TR6, were quite sophisticated. Something that would grow to be an almighty problem for its name-only successor. Due to their success in the 60s and 70s, Triumph are often described as Britain's BMW, and that characterisation is by no means unfair. The Triumph 2000 was absolutely a match for BMW's Neue Klasse back in 1963, both with smart and characterful styling, upmarket aspirations and semi-trailing arm independent rear suspension. The Brit even had a straight six, something the Bavarians wouldn't manage until the end of the decade, but in later years we met the TR6, the Stag and the Dolomite, the Sprint version of the latter becoming the first mainstream saloon car with 4 valves per cylinder. Although lacking a big saloon and coupe, Triumph had a range that was far sportier and more dynamic than that of BMW. Triumphs were smart and sophisticated motorcars, and it's telling that when BMW entered the sports car market, the style of the Z3 emulated the Spitfire. And there's no doubt that the Z4 Coupe was a latter-day Triumph GT6. BMW even retained the Triumph brand for safekeeping when they split up the Rover Group in 2000. But I digress. What I'm saying is that the Triumph name really stood for something in the mid-1970s. And this is why BL chose them over MG to represent their new sports car. But on the other hand, this is British Leyland in the mid-1970s, and trailing arms, with their CV joints and whatnot, are just a little bit too expensive. The MG B had made do since 1962 with not only a rear live axle, but leaf springs and the aforementioned lever arm dampers. Simple, affordable, acceptable, reliable. The Triumph TR7 therefore regressed to feature a live axle. Yet again, this car appears to be a very poor relation to its lineage, a TR lacking independent rear suspension for the first time since 1965. But conversely, if we treat it like a mainstream sports car, it's a heck of a lot more sophisticated than an MG B. A live axle this may be, but not all live axles are created equally. The 7's platform was designed by Spen King, formerly of Rover, where he developed legends including the P6 and original Range Rover. When transferred to Canley, creating this new rear end was his first job. The order of the day was simplicity, converting the unreliable front-wheel drive of the Triumph 1300 into the competent yet affordable rear-wheel drive Triumphs Toledo and Dolomite. It's an enlargement of this rear axle that found its way into the TR7 and later even the Rover SD1, meaning it lived through to 1986 and certainly never disgraced itself. In his later years at BL, the great Spen King proved himself a master in taking simple on-paper components and transforming them into something that would match, and in some cases even exceed, the efforts of everyone else. The Triumph TR7 is no cart-sprung Ford Escort. Under here are 4 links and coil springs, making its on-limit character more predictable than a TR6, and while they never quite rose to the top, TR7s and big Rovers never disgraced themselves at the hands of Tony Pond. This is the point where I'd hoped to be driving this miraculously rare sports car, but I'm afraid I've opted not to. You see, I've driven TR7s before, so in terms of their platform, I know what they're about. The novelty here is the 16-valve engine we'll get to, and this one could do with some love. The problem is merely one of fueling, too much of it from the twin SUs. The chokes aren't sticking, so I guess it's a float problem, and such a rich mixture means we aren't getting the required performance. More crucial, however, are my worries about bore wash, so don't blame me for erring on the side of caution when it comes to a genuine piece of history. Regardless, independent rear suspension is very nice to have, and in my experience of the Stag, those semi-trailing arms feel delightful. Shock horror, it feels like a 70s or 80s BMW, and that's fantastic. But back in the mid-60s, the TR5, with its fancy suspension, was described as being an engine in search of a chassis. A decade on, early reviews of the TR7 threw that on its head, describing this car, with its simple live axle, as a chassis in search of an engine. We'll get to the powertrain later on, but that's an indication of this car's competence. A live axle was nothing to be ashamed of, but it didn't light up the spec sheet. Regardless, that's how this car feels. Competent. First and foremost, however, it feels slightly cumbersome. Lithesome in a way an MG B is, the TR7 is not. With its high scuttle, low driving position and saloon car dimensions, this feels like a relatively big car, and the controls all command a solidity, furthering that character. The TR7 makes you a deliberate driver, pondering upon the effort required by the clutch, brakes, steering and gears. Certainly, it isn't playful. it feels serious. The ride is perfectly comfortable, but in achieving that, the front suspension is a little too soft. There is body roll present, the pop-up headlamps pitching and diving on entry, but don't let that fool you into not trusting the Triumph. You may have to bulk up to do so, but grabbing this car by the scruff of the neck allows you to meet it eye to eye and figure out that this is a real sports car, just not the type you might be used to. Think mini Stag rather than big Spitfire, and you're 3/4 the way there. The limit of grip is far later than you'd expect, and if you have the muscle, then correcting is merely a matter of telling it who's boss. It's intuitive, and that breeds confidence. But unlike a little 700kg midget or Spitfire, the big 1000kg TR7 could not cope with an engine as small as 1500cc. Not with any sporting intentions anyway. With its Harris Mann styling and Spen King suspension, this is the real Triumph-sourced element of this car. A 2-litre version of their overhead cam slant 4, first seen in 1968 in the Saab 99 of all things. Back when they were effectively independent, Triumph began developing this unit as a modular engine, able to replace all of their existing engines with a 1500 to 2-litre inline 4 and a 3 to 4-litre V8. Not all of these capacities ended up making it, but during development, Saab got wind of this engine and struck a deal with Triumph to both partly fund it and then produce it themselves. That's why the Saab 99 was the first to be powered by Triumph's new engine, and modified by the Swedes, it's the same basic engine that would later power the 900 Turbo. The first Triumph to feature overhead camshafts was the 3-litre 8-cylinder Stag in 1970, followed 2 years later by the 4-pot Dolomite 1850. The TR7 was therefore the second, and in the end final, Triumph to use the 4-cylinder version of this new engine. Expanded to 2 litres and with twin carburettors, that means a thoroughly respectable, if not enchanting, 105 brake horsepower. Now, if we relate this again to the old TR6, then from a British perspective, it's disappointing. With fuel injection on its 2.5-litre 6, the old car had 150 brake horsepower. But remember, our benchmark is really the MG B, which in European spec made 95 brake horsepower from its archaic 1800 B series. The problem, again, is the American market, where the emissions-friendly TR6 and MG B were choked down to just over 100 brake horsepower and somewhere in the 70s respectively. This isn't to say that the Slant 4 was engineered to meet those standards, not at all. But in all except California, it managed an acceptable 90 brake horsepower. You're probably expecting it anyway, but we have to go through that rigmarole again of putting ourselves in the mindset of a customer who saw this car as the new Triumph TR in the mid-1970s. As a new MG GT, 2 litres and 105 brake horsepower are more than acceptable, more than covering for the extra weight, a TR7 being appreciably quicker than an MG B. Autocar testing it at around 11 seconds to 60, while a chrome bumper BGT a couple of years earlier took closer to 15. A carburettor-fed TR6 would merely match the TR7, but an injected 6 would utterly trounce it, taking only 8 seconds to achieve 60 miles per hour. We've again encountered an impasse where perception cannot have been friendly to this new car. But British Leyland knew this, and as most people knew it, the TR7 was not finished yet. That 2-litre Slant 4, which powered almost every TR7, was only supposed to be the base model. British Leyland perceived this to be a single component in a much wider family of sports cars, filling some of the niches they'd otherwise abandoned. Most persistent in memory is a project known as Lynx, a 4-seat, fastback coupé TR7, designed not only to replace the Stag, but also go head to head with the likes of the Capri, Manta, etc. that we mentioned earlier. But more critically for us, the TR7 was supposed to receive 2 additional engines, one of which this car has. But as I mentioned right at the beginning of this video, this car is an exceedingly rare TR7 Sprint, meaning it features a 16-valve 2-litre slant 4 extracted from the spicy Dolomite Sprint, upping power from 105 to 127 brake horsepower and allowing a sub 10-second 0 to 60. But I'm afraid its rarity is not at all a surprise. The Triumph Stag has received more than a passing mention in this video, and since driving one a few weeks ago, I've fallen madly in love with the things. They are a deity in a world of inadequacy. But as I'm sure all of you know, the Stag was afflicted by one calamitous problem: its sonorous, responsive and rev-happy 3-litre overhead cam V8. Across versions of their new modular engine, Triumph encountered no end of issues. Saab managed to get it right, building it to a much higher standard and correcting some oversights. But here in Britain, 4 or 8 cylinders, these engines earned a very poor reputation. To spin its overhead camshaft, its timing chain couldn't keep itself tensioned. It had a water pump that was both weak and poorly located, and these aluminium cylinder heads were poorly cast, meaning they warped when the water pump inevitably caused it to overheat. Then, if the correct antifreeze wasn't used, everything corroded together into a 45-degree paperweight. These issues were unforgivable back in 1970, but BL being as crippled as they were, Dolomites, Sprints, TR7s and even end-of-the-line Stags all suffered from these issues. Amazingly, these issues never reared their head in testing because engineers were simply too sympathetic and too sensible with them. It was only once out in the world, in haphazard hands and unfavourable conditions, that the cracks began to show. In anticipation of its launch, BL built around 60 of these TR7 Sprints, complete with cool stripes and of course that 16-valve engine. It's not clear exactly why these cars did not become widely available. Some theorise they existed purely for homologation purposes, allowing BL to use them in rallying. Others suggest they ditched it in favour of the V8 we'll come to, but some suggest it was planned for all 3 engines to coexist. The Sprint ditched either due to reliability or US emissions concerns. Whatever the truth is, there was no launch, no brochures and very limited exposure in any other media. Even handbooks were work in progress and repair manuals suggested the Sprint was upcoming. All I know is that SJW541S is listed in British Leyland documentation, with white paint and green trim, and is believed to be a car reserved for the press. Well everybody, the press finally has their hands on a Triumph TR7 Sprint, at least if you describe me as such. But again, I'm taking pity on the guardians of this archaeological find, so this is where I cannot quite report on the pace of the Sprint. A standard TR7 is not a slow car per se, just one that could cope with a heck of a lot more. Considering the stats, I'd wager that this engine fills that expectation, but the Slant 4 is not an engine I'm overly enamoured by. I've driven a fair few cars with this engine now, and though you'd expect it to be rev-happy, smooth and sonorous, I'm afraid it really isn't. Instead, they feel very old school, in that a TR7 loves to chug along, riding on the torque it offers, but feeling out of puff at higher revs. Now, the 16-valve head may well change that, but what I'm sure it doesn't is the refinement. Taken generally, the TR7 is a very refined car indeed, but its weak link is the engine, which booms, always sounding and feeling coarse. It's nowhere near as nice as the old BMC B series, never mind a little overhead cam Lampredi Fiat engine. Now, if a really good TR7 isn't like this, then fair enough. And I'd love to drive one, plus the Stag's V8, which is just 2 slant 4s, is delectable. But with only 4 cylinders, I'm just not that enchanted. The TR7 is a chassis looking for an engine, not only in terms of performance. And having mentioned the Stag, it brings me closer to the character flaws present in this car. As we established earlier, the TR7 is a hefty car, and if you're all for that, then wonderful. But a Fiat X19 or a Lotus Elan has delicacy, and are cars you drive considerately. This isn't that. And in a 4-seat V8 GT like the Stag, a very mechanical gear change is an expectation. Here, however, I'm not convinced. If the TR7 is an affordable 2-seat sports car, then I'd expect it to feel almost totally different. Not necessarily better, just to inhabit an altogether different mantra. But in passing all of a few minutes ago, I let slip the TR7's ultimate go faster engine. But with 8 cylinders installed, it's not the V8 we've built ourselves up to expect. Thanks to this car's dimensions, weight and one-size-fits-all nature, a much larger engine was planned right from the beginning. The Stag had already been fitted with the baby 3-litre version of the Triumph V8, and with room for a 4-litre, even 32-valve variant, plus fuel injection that's rumoured to have been tried behind the scenes, the TR7 could have been a genuine supercar slayer. But as that engine's reputation tumbled down to earth before even the 7's launch, it was Rover's V8 that was chosen for the car finally christened as the Triumph TR8. Again, before the two were operationally merged, Rover knew they required a new engine. Their old straight 6 was truly an antique, and they spotted an opportunity to buy a V8 from General Motors. The 215 had found itself an orphan after a mere 2 years of life. It may have powered the Buick Special, Pontiac Tempest and even the turbocharged Oldsmobile Jetfire, but by American standards it was a little too experimental. What became the Rover V8 is undoubtedly older and less sophisticated than the overhead cam Triumph V8, but the two share their aluminium construction. Back in the early 60s, the Americans hadn't mastered its casting, and with many a block becoming porous, they scrapped it in 1963. For a European manufacturer building much smaller cars, an all-alloy V8 was a big deal. It was lighter than many contemporary 4s, so Rover bought it, improved it, and fitted it to their existing saloons from 1967. It would power the Range Rover for over 30 years, becoming one of the most popular engines the world has ever seen. Before they began expanding it, it was also considered bulletproof, and for a few years it even found service in the MG B. It was a no-brainer for Triumph to also use this engine, never mind the Rover SD1 also receiving 3.5 litres of orphaned American alloy. For reasons I don't quite understand, however, the TR8 was not forthcoming. Tony Pond rallied a fair few in the late 70s, badged as the TR7 V8, and in 1978 a batch were built to evaluate. But as for customers, over 5 years went by before they could order a TR8. By this point the car was beginning to grow old, and with BL looking to a streamlined future, the wedge was not long for this world. The United States received the Triumph TR8 in May 1980, but in Britain they were never really sold before these cars ceased production only a year later. Reportedly, there were 35 UK spec TR8s from a total of 2,715. Even built by a firm as troubled as British Leyland, The waiting for a TR7 Sprint or TR8, never mind their ultimate rarity, makes absolutely zero sense. Back in '75, the basic TR7 was described as being a chassis in search of an engine. And in spite of the work having been done, BL just stood back and watched as everybody asked for something better. When the V8 was finally installed, Car and Driver described it as the reinvention of the sports car. But again, BL just weren't interested. 5.5 years earlier, at the end of 1974, the Triumph TR7 was launched into the world. For over a year, it could only be bought across the Atlantic, the US being such a money spinner for BL that the UK would have to wait until production grew. It was the summer of '76 by the time we got to drive the new car, and in spite of its on-paper weaknesses, praise was almost universal. Sure, some were alienated by the styling, but there was nothing untoward. Nothing that would seriously scupper its progress until everything went very British Leyland. Thanks to government policy in the 50s and 60s, many manufacturers were encouraged to expand their operations into different parts of the country. Triumph's traditional home was in Canley, near Coventry, and as the result of an acquisition, they opened a plant in Speke, near Liverpool in 1961. Now in theory, there was nothing wrong with this, but beside Dolomite and Stag body shells, Speke was chosen to produce the TR7 in its entirety. BL as a whole was suffering immense quality and production ills, but as the new halo of their mainstream range, the TR7 was in everybody's gaze. It wasn't long before stories of desperate quality emerged, only adding to questions over the engine. As a newly nationalised concern, strikes across BL became national news, Speke often featuring. By November '76, production had effectively halted, and those that did emerge fared worse than ever. The following year, the reins of BL were handed to Sir Michael Edwards, who was not afraid of either a fight or a tough decision. Speke was to be closed, and the TR7 shifted south to Canley. For most of '77 and '78, therefore, simply buying a TR7 was not easy. In the midst of all this stress, the Sprint and the Lynx coupé were canned, and by 1980, with barely a moment of rest, Canley had also stopped building cars forever. A final year's worth of TR7s were built at Solihull, Rover's traditional home, before the thing was put out of its misery. The Triumph TR7 proved to be the death knell of the Triumph Slant 4, BL's presence in America, the Triumph name as a genuine force, the classic British sports car as a genre, and 2 production plants. But even with all these problems, plus those of perception we've already explored, the fixed head body, the 4-cylinder engine, the live rear axle and the TR nameplate, you cannot ever describe it as anything other than a fundamentally decent car. It may not be to everyone's taste, but nothing ever is, and I think I've cracked a shell revealing what the TR7 really is, because an out-and-out classic British sports car, this is not, but I think that's okay. Motorcars can be 2 things at once, because on paper, with its 2-seat layout, rear drive power and spectacularly bold styling, this is a sports car. But so's a Mercedes SL. Do you get what I'm saying? The sports car's most basic components are delicacy, fieriness and agility, all things a Fiat X19 has in spades, but an SL is devoid of. The Triumph TR7 is relatively quiet, genuinely comfortable, extremely practical, and though the two are very different, I relate it more to the Stag than I do the MG B. It's a thoroughly capable Grand Tourer, and had they come with V8s right from the beginning, people would have understood that, myself included. British Leyland met their goal in producing a car that was much more refined than any sports car before, but accidentally they diluted all of that sports car character clean out of it. With a rather coarse engine and a cumbersome feeling body, at least in little old Britain, this car needed every bit of help it could get, and that TR7 badge, despite its history, cannot have helped. Before even hitting the showrooms, people had an expectation of it. So had it been badged as the Triumph Bullet or as a new MG GT, then perception would have immediately improved because it no longer appeared to be a poor relation. There's no doubting that a drop-head body should always have been available, as should a V8, but even with those additions, I don't think this car could have escaped the clutches of its maker. If we bypass its fabulous plaid interior, any reservations as to the TR7's quality can only have worsened when met with the likes of this dashboard. Sure, it's a modern plastic moulding, but it's ill-finished, has exposed screw heads everywhere you look, and just seems like a prototype. A Fiat X19 appears to be a far higher quality car than a Triumph TR7, and that's not saying much. By 1976, the MG B had grown to represent the good old days. In its early life, it had received its iconic character as a result of the good times, and it continued to sell well into old age because people viewed it with a fully deserved rose-tinted glow. It also kept Abingdon ticking over before Sir Michael Edwards finally closed it in 1980. But in those final years, MG was the BL mark with the highest production standards and the lowest strike rate. An antique it may have been, but it would probably have lasted better and certainly would have been easier to buy than a TR7. It's been said that the MGB remained in production to offer that lower entry point, but I don't buy this. The TR7 is not a TR6 replacement. It is an MGB replacement. And if value for money was so important, then the MG Midget and the Triumph Spitfire were still available. Instead, I see this as part fear, driven by BL's general predicament, and part realisation that this new car had outgrown its roots in the great British countryside. The Triumph TR7 is an American car, and it's no worse for that, only different. And as it was originally conceived, one part of a tapestry of closely related BL sports cars, I grow to see its value. The TR7 is a car people love to hate. In that way, it's typical BL, a punchbag in 70s Britain because, quite frankly, in many ways it deserves it. But if the TR6 was your metric for success, then this car trounced its father. In being more affordable and more practical, more refined and more efficient, British Leyland built over 114,000 of them across just over 6 years of production. The TR6, however, was built for a little bit longer, and they sold only 91,000 of those. The problem comes when we bring in the MG B. The world's favourite sports car of all time was sold over 500,000 times between 1962 and 1980. That means that the TR7 had to compete for almost its entire life with its biological father, and the MGB outsold this car in every year they were built side by side but one. In terms of its controversy and its obvious quality issues, the TR7 did not lead the life that British Leyland expected of it. This car was a new kind of sports car, one that maybe diluted its DNA just a little bit too much. And with that, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then do please follow the link down in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.